Blue Coal presents The Shadow. With today's thrilling adventure, your Blue Coal dealers commence a new season and a sensational new series of The Shadow, your favorite mystery drama.
Who knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men? The Shadow knows.
Sorry to interrupt, boys.
The Shadow.
Yes, the Shadow.
Out over the cold hills to the state's prison.
Shadow comes for revenge.
The computer's going to tell us who the Shadow is.
The Shadow knows.
Surely you're not afraid of death.
Crime does not pay. The Shadow knows.
Agents of the Shadowcast, report! For the only podcast on the internet devoted exclusively to the immortal exploits of the pistol-packing pulp avenger, The Shadow. In keeping with the theme of the last episode, we are going to discuss the filmic efforts of The Shadow on the silver screen. And at first glance, perhaps to the neophyte in shadowy matters, this might actually seem a somewhat thin topic, but the truth is that The Shadow, by the time, most people seem to think that the 1994 film, which we reviewed in the last episode, was the only proper attempt to bring The Shadow to the screen. Oh, there was some old black and white stuff, but nobody really paid attention to that, right? But the truth is, by the time the 1994 film came along, it was something like the 7th attempt to bring The Shadow to the screen. Now, there's no arguing it was certainly the biggest budget. It was certainly the most earnest attempt to bring The Shadow to the screen, at least outside of the film serial, which we're going to review very soon as well. But the truth is, The Shadow had a very well-established history on cinema screens throughout the 30s and 40s. Indeed, the entire reason that Street and Smith started publishing the Shadow magazine was an attempt to guard their intellectual property, which increasingly, at the hands of Hollywood, was beginning to become perilously close to being ripped off. There was already a film called The Shadow in the 30s. I have no idea how they didn't wind up getting sued for that one. There were a whole lot of different things. The Shadow of this, The Shadow of that. And it's just seemed like more and more creators, more and more directors and writers were butting up mighty close against Street and Smith's intellectual property. And so one of the reasons Walter B. Gibson was hired to be the writer of the first several Shadow stories was he was contracted originally to do 4, because the idea was, well, if we establish it as a quarterly, that's a year's worth of publications, and therefore we will have sort of a publication history in order to establish this is our intellectual property. Anybody who comes along and tries to make their version of this and rip it off, as more and more people were, we can take them to court and kind of defend our IP.
And I was thinking of getting into radio, but just then came word that they needed a Shadow character, Street and Smith. Wanted to have somebody write a character story about the Shadow in order to protect it. And so that's how I got my job, as to writing a quarterly.
Well, Bill Ralston, the general manager, he said, if we've got the Shadow and people are talking about the Shadow, why don't we put out a magazine and call it The Shadow?
Curiously, Street and Smith didn't do that much, as many of you have noticed. There were a whole lot of ripoffs. Walter B. Gibson called the Batman famously a clowned-up version of the Shadow, and he certainly wasn't far off the mark. Bill Finger later on would admit that the first Batman story was stolen from the Shadow, and that wasn't the only thing. The Joker and many other elements, Commissioner Gordon, there were a lot of things that were taken directly from the Shadow, but Street and Smith never seemed to take anybody really to court, just as Condé Nast don't do much to defend the Shadow IP, which they are about to lose in a year or two, by the way. It's going to enter the public domain. But to answer that question, before we actually move on and review this film from the golden age of Hollywood and the golden age of the Shadow as a mainstream pop culture icon, to answer that question, why was DC never sued over literally stealing the first Batman story from the Shadow? And I think the answer is pretty simple. Batman wasn't that big a deal. He wasn't that big a deal in the late 30s and early 40s. I think you have to understand DC or DC Comics, they have done a fair amount of revisionism on the subject of what a big character Batman was right from the outset. His comic was certainly successful. It's kind of saved Detective Comics, but the sort of modern conception that Batman's first appearance was this huge pop culture explosion, that's probably a more accurate description of something like Superman or Spider-Man. Batman was a slower burn, and the truth is Batman really didn't ascend to the kind of commercial heights that he would later enjoy until, 50s, when it got a lot campier, and certainly into the 60s, and culminating in the Adam West TV show, which honestly, that was a big pop culture touchstone. It really, really was. That was a big moment for the character. So I am of the sincere opinion, and I'd be interested to hear what you think in the comments section, or send us over a message or whatever on Blogspot, wherever you want to beard us, or we're also on Facebook. Why do you think they never sued? I personally think Batman just kind of escaped their notice. Plus, you have to remember, Street and Smith were publishing comic books at the time, and they were selling. They were doing very, very well. There were probably some times that the Shadow comic book outsold Batman. We don't have those sales figures, so this is pure speculation, but the Shadow was certainly popular enough at the time, and his comic went for over 100 issues. So that's a long time to be publishing something if it's not selling well. I would tend to think it was doing very, very well. It is, to this day, the longest-running Shadow comic in existence. And indeed, that comic would be published over the course of the 1940s. We'll be reviewing some issues of that. We've already kind of touched up against it in the past. But, folks, right in the heart of all of this explosion in popularity for the Shadow. The Shadow was popular during the Depression era. It was really a product of the Depression era. Into the pre-war period, when we were beginning to be on war footing, here in the United States anyways, with Japan and Germany and Italy, and then even into the World War II era. The World War II paper rationing certainly hurt the pulp industry, but it did not hurt the popularity of the Shadow. He was as popular as he had ever been, and perhaps nothing is a greater indication of that fact than the fact that in 1946, when the war was over, Monogram Pictures picked up the rights for 3 Shadow films, and they wanted that payday so quick, they cranked these out mere months apart. All 3 of these movies would be released over the course of 1 year, 1946. I mean, this was a sausage factory, folks. The first of these is called The Shadow Returns, and we're going to review it today. Its sequel was called The Shadow Behind the Mask, and the culmination of this sort of doomed trilogy was a film by the name of The Missing Lady, very generic kind of Sherlock Holmesian title, and honestly, generic kind of encapsulates this. These are curious finds. I find they slip under the radar. The first 2 Shadow films, one of which we've already reviewed, The Shadow Strikes and International Crime, those were they were definitely budget affairs, but they were a slightly more sincere attempt, I guess, to really have a prestige film in theaters that was The Shadow. They sort of botched it. As we said in our review of The Shadow Strikes, it was an admirable effort to directly adapt a pulp story, in this case, The Ghost of the Manor. Today's film, which is The Shadow Returns, is a far less earnest attempt to adapt from the pulps, but there are some elements of it. I detected some elements of the Romanov jewels, very, very light elements, but for the most part, these are taken from the radio incarnation of The Shadow, and you can see that pretty immediately when you watch this film. To summarize, if Warner Brothers were the big leagues and RKO were, say, the Bush leagues, Monogram Pictures was straight up Skid Row cinema. These movies were made so cheap, even the audience owed the actors money. And speaking of the actors, Kane Richmond, who's our star, he might at a glance appears sort of a perfectly staid choice of quasi-humorous, handsome-esque leading man, but the truth was, he was chosen for reasons that I suspect Walter Gibson would approve of. He was, contrary to all of his biographies online, a professional magician in addition to being an actor. a fact that somehow just slipped the mind of whoever has written his Wikipedia page, his IMDb page, his whatever. I actually have seen the posters and such that I've seen of him having been a performing magician. I assume once he became an actor, he did that less and less. But the truth was that was one of the things that attracted them to casting Kane Richmond in this role. He was sort of a perennial serial star. And really, when you break this down, these are almost glorified serials. You release 3 of these in a single year, and it was intended to go even longer than this. In sort of an alternate universe, I wonder if you almost couldn't have had these released as like a long-form serial series. It wouldn't have been all that unique. There were a number of serial characters and such that had these sort of long-form serialized movies that were really cranked out in this Filmic sausage factory kind of sense. But, of course, our ingenue is Margot Lane, and they bring her in, of course, because by now that was firmly established on the radio and in the comics and now in the pulps as well. Walter Gibson was impelled by the popularity of the radio program to introduce the Margot Lane character. Canadian actress Barbara Reed, who makes a somewhat blathering turn as Margot Lane here, she was actually wooed out of early retirement to play this role. Like 4 years prior, she had married her husband. She bore the first of 2 kids and sort of waved farewell forever to Tinseltown. Then Monogram came calling, and she actually, after this, she worked a few years thereafter before retiring for good and later dying at the ripe old age of 45 years old. Golden Age actors and actresses, they were just built different, folks. Shrivi, who begins as a chauffeur, but sort of alternates as a butler later in the series. You're welcome once again, Batman. Was played by veteran character actor Tom Dugan, who was actually only at Monogram Studios because he wanted to sell a screenplay. But when they got a look at his lined face and his natural comedic timing, they cast him as the cabbie in question almost on the spot. He's interesting. We'll talk about the choices there. Speaking of Barbara Reed, I'm reasonably certain they paid Barbara Reed on a per au Lamont basis.
Why don't we get married?
Well, okay. Right now, tonight.
Oh, Lamont, darling, do you mean it? Oh, Lamont, you're wonderful. Then you mean you'll give up?
Oh, no.
Oh, Lamont.
This is a trope straight from the Orson Welles radio drama, as you can hear in an episode I actually recreated and uploaded myself entitled Danger in the Dark.
Oh, Lamont, why do you take any of these chances? Won't you ever give it up? This masquerade as the Shadow?
And then what?
Then perhaps you could settle down and be like other people. We might even, I don't know.
You mean get married?
Yes.
My dear, that is something that's been close to my heart for a long time, you know that. But until the Shadow finishes his work, I cannot allow myself to think of anything else. Just be patient, dearest. Someday... Well, I'm afraid I've got to run off now.
You know, where does this come from? Where does this approach come from in this movie? I mean, it comes from the simple fact that we reference the Adam West Batman show, but the Shadow had his camp period too. In fact, the Shadow had his sort of camp period 2 decades before Batman did, only in lieu of giant pennies, polar bears, and the Batootsie, it was sort of bog standard screwball comedy romance, sort of ripped off from the Thin Man. That's always been my impression of it. It's sort of that male-female will they, won't they kind of banter that you get in the Thin Man series. This particular adaptation takes it a step further by having them be engaged. It establishes they've been engaged for over a year at the events of this film.
Take it easy, Margot. There's nothing to worry about.
There isn't. You run too many risks. I want to be your wife, darling, not your widow. If you keep on, what does that leave me?
Right where you are, darling.
Yeah, I know, just the Shadow's little shadow. Do you realize that in 3 weeks we will have been engaged a whole year?
Mm-hmm.
Margot, why are you still wasting your time with this dude? My goodness, put a ring on it. After introducing the proper conflict of the film, we're introduced to who are, I suppose, supposed to be Hawkeye and Burbank, who are in this film for no reason in particular.
Just got word from headquarters, Burbank. They're opening the grave right now.
Nice going, Hawkeye.
You know what this struck me? It was a bit bit like the Daredevil Born Again or Marvel movie version of fan service, where we sort of slap an all-new, unctuous, and uninteresting character right into the flick, and we fire a fan favorite name at him from an Easter egg launcher. And, oh, hey, you're Heather Glenn. You know what I mean? But it's not Heather Glenn, because it's not the same character. She's a psychiatrist or whatever. Same thing. So Hawkeye and Burbank, who don't look or sound or behave like Hawkeye or Burbank, are just sitting in some nebulous remote location, and they ring up the Shadow to let him know about a jewel theft from a graveyard. Apparently, a man, this is left a little bit nebulous, actually, which is a problem in this movie in general. There's kind of an over-explanation and a lack of explanation, and these problems sort of alternate. But they are digging up a grave because someone has shipped in a number of gems in a box that they hid in a coffin with a corpse, I guess in order to escape customs. Before they can even explain exactly why this is, they sort of move on to the next plot point. But there's a man in a very fake beard that you can immediately tell is not an old stooped man. The audio quality on every single DVD copy, there are no Blu-ray copies, is so bad that you can't really tell what his name is. I didn't check the credits, but it's Yeoman. I'll just say Yeoman. And he's sort of impelling the police to crack open this coffin so they can get him. And they do show the gems. They look very, very cheap, like a lot of things in this movie, because this is a very cheaply made film. In fact, I would say, of all the elements in this movie, one of the weakest elements is something introduced almost immediately, and that is the soundtrack. And that is repetitive. There's like 2 music tracks, and they play over and over again. They never play when it's time for an action scene, because then they would have to write new music, and they don't want to do that. They want to reuse the soundtrack. This is a blatantly recycled soundtrack from prior Monogram movies. If you watch Monogram pictures, and I do watch old black and white movies quite a bit, you'll recognize this soundtrack. You will have heard it in other things. Kind of like when I do a movie review show called Rageaholic Cinema, and I review old, cheesy 80s action movies. And in a more contemporary context, the studio that would do this was Cannon Films. Cannon Films, if you've watched one action movie with Chuck Norris, you've watched them all in a sense, because they all have the same soundtrack. Invasion USA has the same soundtrack as, I forget if it's Missing in Action 3, I think it is. And, a number of those movies all have the kind of recycled soundtrack. And I still remember in the Cannon Films documentary, I forget if it was Golan or Globus, who basically said that the reason they kept reusing the soundtrack was it was a massive cost-cutting measure. Instead of hiring an entire symphony orchestra to score your film, like a Denis Villeneuve movie would now, they would hire like a 6-piece, and then they would multi-track it so it sounded bigger. They would hire like a 6-piece brass section, and then they'd just fill it out to sound like an entire symphony orchestra when there really was not a symphony orchestra. So funny. You can see the inspiration from the radio show, which makes perfect sense. I've showed off some of the ratings from this period of the show, 45, 46, 47. The ratings on that show were nuts. They would be nuts for a television show. Today, we're talking 12.0s, 13.0s, like crazy, crazy ratings. This was a very popular radio program at the time. So obviously, they're drawing inspiration from the radio show. Why wouldn't you? And one of the most obvious elements in which that has happened is the comedy bits with Shrevey. They are just straight up implanted, in particular from the Bill Johnstone era of the Shadow radio program.
Get that crate out of here.
Crate? This ain't no crate. This
Get
is
it out of here fast.
Oh, all right. I should have said to him, who pays your wages? I do, the taxpayer. That's what I should have said to him.
Oh, you should have, eh?
Yes, I should have. But I didn't. Excuse me.
And I have to say, on that subject, Tom Dugan, who plays Shrevey, he does a fine job, but like Peter Boyle, he is not. And perhaps that's not fair, because let's be real, Peter Boyle had better material to work with. As underutilized as the superb cast of the 1994 Shadow film was, they did get a little bit more meat on the bone. You got that scene with Shrivi explaining to Roy Tam, who are you? I'm someone that the Shadow saved, just like you, right? Little moments like that give you just a little bit of character, a little bit of spice. He gets that stuff. Tom Dugan doesn't get that stuff. He's purely there for comedic purposes. That's all and a number of characters you could say that about. Speaking of which, Inspector Sleepy Joe Cardona and Commissioner Weston are introduced, and frankly, they look and act more like retired police officers than actual ones.
Fine job you're doing, Inspector. Inspector Cardona.
Oh, sorry, Commissioner Weston. I haven't had any sleep in 4 days.
I understand. How many jobs you on now? 5?
No, 4. The night I got that girl who tattooed her boyfriend with a hatchet.
Good.
The only good thing about it is your nephew hasn't been around bothering me.
I know how you feel, but Lamont's a good boy. I let him hang around because he's interested in studying criminology.
I wish he'd go to Alaska and take a course by correspondence. Oh, what I mean, Commissioner, is
It's odd because Weston and Cardona have essentially traded narrative places, with Cardona, who in the pulps and comics is usually defending the Shadow and even at one point becomes an agent of the Shadow, essentially. He is the one who hates Lamont Cranston here. And the Commissioner, who explicitly disbelieves the existence of the Shadow in the pulps and so forth. Here, he's linked at the hip to Lamont Cranston and even defends him. So we have flipped roles here, and again, for no good narrative reason. I understand you need the kind of fractious relationship between Weston and Cardona. That's present in the pulps. That's present in the radio show. Cardona and Weston are both characters in the radio drama at times. But it's just odd that they would flip their roles here. And it should be said, this movie introduces the idea of Lamont Cranston being the police chief, Commissioner Weston's nephew. This is an idea that was actually reintroduced in the Alec Baldwin 1994 film, although in that case, it was not Commissioner Weston. So we set up a jewel theft, but there's something off about it. It's transported in a coffin, really for no good reason, and no good reason that's ever explicitly explained, at least not that I caught. I should add, the version of the film that I was watching had some audio problems at various points, and that was an original artifact from whatever the transfer was. Guys, why do we not preserve our films properly? I have bought actual licensed DVD copies of movies and had problems like this. I've had VHS tracking on the DVD copies before. It's ridiculous, and these Shadow films, these 1946 trio of Shadow films are notorious for having this problem. I've noticed there's kind of some disreputable sellers on eBay and such that have complete Shadow film collections, and they include these, but even those are terribly artifacted. They're gross. They don't sound good or look good. It is a shame that someone hasn't gotten a hold of these, because interest in the Shadow has steadily grown over the years. And the Shadow has his hardcore fans, and his hardcore fans spend money. It would be worth it for them to find the original film negatives, or at least a decent condition film reel, and transfer these properly over to a Blu-ray, at least with a little bit of trivia or whatever. I mean, you could literally crib some of the trivia out of the back of The Shadow Strikes. The Shadow Strikes comic from the late 80s included all kinds of cool production snippets about the production of the 1946 series. This is an interesting kind of middle piece. If I could sort of summarize what this trio of movies is relative to all the others, I would say these movies in general are much more watchable than the Rod LaRoque movies that came several years before. They're definitely far more watchable, but they're also even lower budget, if you can believe it. And they're nowhere near as sincere as the 1994 film, and certainly not as sincere as the 1940 film serial. That's probably the great tragedy here, is these three movies follow the 1940 film serial, which was a huge success, a massive success, and was such a success, in fact, a little bit of a bidding war took place for the sequel. And Columbia were really eager to have a second Shadow film serial ready to go. They were already in production. They had a story picked out. They were ready to go. They had even started filming little bits and bobs of it, constructing sets and so forth. and then Condé Nast, or not Condé Nast, Street and Smith at the time, pardon me, they decided they wanted a little bit more money, I think is what happened. There was some kind of rights snafu, and ultimately Street and Smith wound up reneging on the rights. And so Columbia had basically this fully formed serial, had no idea what to do with it. We'll talk about this when we review the Columbia serial, but basically what winds up happening is Columbia take the existing season 2 of the Shadow film serial and turn it into the Spider film serial, one of the most blatant ripoffs of the Shadow ever to be created in pulp form or any other. The Spider would not exist without the Shadow for all of his many, many merits. So here we have a kind of halfway creative victory in these 3 movies. And I think of the 3, probably The Shadow Returns is simultaneously the most watchable of the 3, and yet maybe has the greatest identity crisis of all 3. All 3 of these movies seem to kind of pivot and try to take a different approach to how they portray the Shadow character. This one, if you're looking for a good adaptation of the radio show, oh man, you could do way worse than this one. It does that arguably better than the 1994 film, which had no small amount of homage to the original radio show. As I said when I was reviewing that, I think of all the different versions, it was the radio version that David Koepp, who wrote the script for that film, seemed the most familiar with, and to this day, indeed, that is the most popular version of the Shadow, and probably the way that most people know the character, at least outside of the 94 film. The man in the fake beard goes into the house, because we've always got to have a massive mansion. That's always got to be in any cheap 1940s mystery or crime movie. We've always got to settle that. Isn't it funny? Somehow these movies always seem to devolve into a single oversized mansion set and an increasingly contrived Agatha Christie whodunit plot. That's basically what happens here. The guy with the obviously fake beard runs inside the house and then disappears. He disappears. And then another guy comes up behind him, and we're left to assume he's got the dark sunglasses on, so he's the obvious red herring bad guy. Oh, hello! And the guy in the beard was wearing sunglasses too, so we just assume it's the same guy. Obvious red herring narratively. And then we introduce this cast of characters who never really get to be characters, who, it turns out, were pooling together their own sort of ad hoc corporation so that they could legally buy these gems from the coffin that were just pulled out. But the guy, Yeoman, who got them, he's disappeared now. And then people, one by one, start dying. And they all seem to die the same way. They keep being pulled over the edge of railing, or seemingly jumping off of railing. But the way that it happens, it's clear there's something more going on. You can't quite figure out what it is. The explanation, when it does finally arrive, is suitably ridiculous. I mean, it is risibly stupid. But we go through this kind of whodunit, and the mystery itself of the gems and such. Again, some slight reminiscence, especially when we get down to when Lamont Cranston, who apparently, he's an amateur criminologist here, like a lot of versions of the Shadow during this era on film, including the film serial version. He knows everything for some reason. He knows crime fighting. He knows firearms. He knows chemistry. He knows all of these things. And really, this is the incongruity. This is Lamont Cranston. In this version of the Shadow, Lamont Cranston is the Shadow. And it's Lamont Cranston. It's his real character. The Lamont Cranston of the pulps is kind of flippant, and he's described as almost sleepy, a little bit droll. He's sort of wisecracking sometimes. He's a little irreverent. He seems not quite interested in what's going on in the plot, but of course that's a feint, right? The Shadow is, in fact, very, very keenly paying attention to what's going on, and it's the identity of Lamont Cranston that makes it seem like he's sort of a lackadaisical playboy that takes people off their guard, and then he learns things that he might not otherwise learn. In this, Lamont Cranston is a wealthy young man about town, and he is irreverent both in and out of costume. Another curious creative choice. The Shadow has a costume. It's kind of ridiculous. It's sort of a Green Hornet style costume where he's got this sort of Phantom of the Opera mask on, but otherwise it's just a hat, not a slouch hat, but a fedora and a trench coat. And that's it. Oh, and a revolver that he carries around and never uses. He pretty much just points it at people. That appears to be the whole reason. This movie, incidentally, is a fantastic example of why the Shadow's costume is not meant to include a trench coat. His outfit, Walter Gibson said this very clearly many, many times. The Shadow doesn't actually have a trench coat. He wears kind of judge's robes over whatever he's got, a suit or whatever is underneath. You never see what's underneath. And the 1940 film serial nails this, right? Victor Jory has this huge sort of cloak, judge's cloak, cape type thing over whatever he's wearing underneath. What he's wearing underneath is stupid. Nobody cares, right? But he's got the gloves, he's got the hat, he's got the whole 9 yards. They really nailed the outfit in the 1940 Victor Jory film serial. But here, his outfit here is nothing but a hat, a face diaper, and a trench coat. And guys, at times it comes across like a dude just running around in his bathrobe. It looks bad. It looks bad. And it's a shame when you go to conventions and stuff and people think, oh yeah, the Shadow, he wears a fedora, he wears a trench coat, he wears it. You're wrong on all counts, and you're going to look really bad. Cosplaying is that. The Shadow wears a cowboy hat. He wears a slouch hat. That's more of a trailblazing kind of frontier hat, not a fedora. And if he wears a coat, it's going to be underneath whatever Inverness cape or cloak or whatever it is, the kind of judge's robes that he's actually supposed to be wearing. And, of course, the red scarf is, you can take or leave. I can take or leave the red scarf. It's certainly on the covers, but canonically, in Walter Gibson's imagination anyways, it would have been silly for him to wear a big red scarf because he's trying to blend into shadows, right? What are you, blending into red shadows? It's kind of like that white ninja from G.I. Joe. What are you, blending into white shadows? What's going on there? There's some halfway decent dialogue in this to sort of complement it. It's just not good shadow dialogue.
Who pays your wages? I do, the taxpayer. That's what I should have said to
Oh,
him.
you should have, eh?
Yes, I should have. But I didn't. Excuse me. Did you hear me tell that Cardona what I think of him?
Why, you told him nothing at all.
It's just what I think of him.
It seems every time I see you, you're with a suspicious character.
Well, every time you see me, Inspector, I'm with you.
Well, we'll just have to draw our own confusions. Did you get that word, boss?
Yeah. Where did you get it?
In the dictionary.
Well, you better put it back.
It is kind of clever and pulpy and a little bit Walter Gibson-ish that it turns out that the gems themselves are not the actual object of the search and of the criminal conspiracy, that actually they think are gems are in fact this crazy industrial grade, a new form of plastic that is indeed worth millions, as gems would have been, but it's honestly worth millions more, because then you could patent the formula and you could manufacture this plastic. You would be a millionaire. Nobody knows this. And the inventor of it, of course, was canny enough to hide the microfilm with the formula inside the hard plastic, quote-unquote, gems. And it's the criminal conspiracy's attempt to acquire those gems so that they can melt them down and discover, right? And you actually need a very specific chemical formula to discover that the microfilm is buried in there, and wouldn't you know it, Lamont Cranston knows just the formula. But I think the most ridiculous thing is what I alluded to before, the murder plot itself. Every single person who has been pulled over an edge was in fact pulled over an edge. And I thought, like, maybe there was something slick on the railing. Maybe, there's a chemistry element to this. Is there some kind of weird silicate gel or something that they keep smearing on the railing? No. They were pulled over by a bullwhip, ladies and gentlemen. And for some reason, it didn't make a bullwhip sound at all.
The cut and the burn were made by the murder weapon. This, or one like it. There are plenty of these hanging on the walls of this house.
I think you hit it, Inspector. The killer standing below with his bullwhip. Each victim had his right hand on or near the railing. Then the killer struck. Then the murderer pulled, tightening the loop. As the victims fell, he flicked the lash free, recoiled his whip, hung it back on the wall, and joined the others rushing to find the newly murdered man.
To protect the secret of the criminal conspiracy. And when the true murderer is uncovered, it is suitably anticlimactic.
The murderer enters, disappears into the library, then comes out of the den with Haston as himself.
Get him, Shreving.
Shadow returns. This is a weird one. It's a weird one. It is massively imperfect. It is as cut rate and bargain basement as it gets for this era of movie making. And yet, in the pantheon of Shadow films, this is probably not far from the top because it is at least faithful to the radio drama. Not very faithful to the pulp. It has pulp elements, as you can see. It has Hawkeye and it has Burbank, but they're not really Hawkeye and Burbank. They're just sort of name dropping, right? Marvel style. It has a plot that is similar to some of the Stolen Jewels plots of Walter B. Gibson, including the element of melting them down to discover. That was a conceit that was used in several of the pulp stories, actually, including the Romanoff jewels. So all of those things do make this feel at least dimly related to the Shadow, and thus I would recommend this. I actually would. This is an enjoyable film. The problem, of course, today in 2025 is, how do you watch this in halfway decent quality? And the truth is you don't. You watch it in about 1/6 decent quality because there are no good quality. I've seen HD rips. I've seen, AI upscaled versions of this. I own a DVD of it. There are no good copies of this movie. There are no good copies of any of these movies, any of these three. We will review number 2 and number 3. Actually, The Shadow Behind the Mask was one of the very first Shadow movies I ever watched. So one of these days, probably in this season, I will review Behind the Mask and The Missing Lady. They're cool in their own right. And I have to say, Kane Richmond as a leading man, he's a good Lamont Cranston for what he's doing. And it's nice that he has a little magic background. He could do sleight of hand stuff, but they don't really have him do that. Barbara Reed is a serviceable radio version of Margot Lane. A little bit ditzy, a little bit boy crazy for Lamont.
Why, you're Lamont Cranston,
Why, yes.
the police commissioner's nephew.
That's right.
But I want you to understand my position in this affair. You see,
Excuse me.
Well,
Oh, go right ahead. Don't mind me.
I don't.
Why did you do that? I might have learned something.
If that's the way you learn things, you'd better remain ignorant.
Well, she does look striking.
Striking? Well, if she hangs around you, she'll look struck. In both eyes.
There's some good banter in this. For the radio version of The Shadow, it's pretty good banter. And it's clearly inspired by stuff like The Thin Man, clearly inspired by the radio drama, which in turn was inspired by the dialogue of The Thin Man. And this kind of screwball stuff, it's fun. It's fun. This stuff was fun in the 1994 film as well. I'm very well endowed, that kind of stuff. That wouldn't be at all out of place here. It's a fun movie. It's a fun Shadow film if you like the radio version and you can kind of turn your brain off a little bit and you don't mind them going to the Shrevey is stupid well one too many times. At one point, Shrevey forgets that he ate all the sandwiches twice in one scene. Just dumb stuff like that. But I really, really do like some of the dialogue here. Like it's solid. The movie could use a lot more atmosphere. I find it interesting that they have a Shadow outfit and then don't use it a whole lot. There is a cool action sequence where the Shadow sort of swings from ropes in a warehouse and kicks some thug ass. And, he's doing Shadow stuff. And you do see the costume in that and see how bad it looks. But for the most part, probably because the director realized how corny it looked, when the Shadow shows up, they show him in shadow, in silhouette. And I actually think that's a reasonably wise choice. Kane Richmond has a cool Shadow voice. It doesn't sound like Kane Richmond. He deepens it. He makes it more gravelly. Like it really does sound. I think they put it through a slight filter like the radio show. Again, an indicia of them being inspired by the radio drama. But The Shadow Returns was the first in this trilogy of films, and it was the last real proper intended for theaters attempt for the next several decades. There would be a couple of film pilots, or TV pilots rather, that would be turned into films later on. The Invisible Avenger, Bourbon Street Shadows, there were actually a couple more movies, but they're movies in name only. They were sold commercially as movies when the TV pilots were not picked up. this particular series of films is actually intended to be films, but they have a serial kind of floozy, cheap kind of aspect to them. And if you sort of leave your expectations at the door, The Shadow Returns is actually very, very enjoyable, and I would recommend it over The Shadow Strikes and International Crime, to tell you the truth. But not all Shadow media is not inspired by the pulps or explicitly eschews the pulp inspiration at all turns, as so much Shadow media does. In fact, the subject of the review at the back half of today's episode, a comic book review, indeed a graphic novel review, is one of the prime exemplars of one that steered into the pulp inspirations and created one of the truly transcendent works in the Shadow's oeuvre. That would be The Shadow, 1941, sometimes subtitled Hitler's Astrologer. In 1987, indeed just 2 years after the death of the Shadow's creator in the pulp magazines, Walter B. Gibson, we would get an issue, this was considered an issue, of the ongoing Marvel Epic Comics graphic novel imprint. It was an interesting thing. They had an ongoing series just called Epic Graphic Novels, and they would make new issues of them, and they would plan them ahead of time, and they would be released almost as an issue, but they were, of course, graphic novel length. This was part of the sort of parting shot of Stan Lee as he was getting ready to leave the company and so forth, where he was impressing upon the company, hey, like, the future of this comic book media, it's what they're doing over in Europe with Metal Hurlant and these sort of anthology magazines that are oversized with beautiful artwork, and they steer into more of the graphic novel format. Today, that's the basis of the entire French comic industry, the Franco-Belgian comic book industry, which I'm a huge fan of. And in more of a digest format, it's also similar to what is being done in Japan. As it turned out, Stan Lee was right on the money. He was absolutely correct that that's the direction that the American comic book industry needed to go in. Sadly, it doesn't feel as if the American comic industry really listened. They're still kind of married to single issues, still married to that dinosaur format. And it's kind of interesting to see how America sort of didn't learn its lessons from this era. But for a brief period in the 1980s, Marvel seemed to be getting it together. And the subject of today's review, this is a long overdue review. It's one of my favorite, and indeed one of the introductory pieces of media for me for the Shadow in the comic book medium. And that is The Shadow, 1941. Hitler's Astrologer. It is written by the great Denny O'Neil, who passed away. We, of course, had a tribute to him in an earlier episode. It is penciled, and breakdowns are done by the great Michael Kaluta. It is, of course, inked by the magnificent Russ Heath. And if I had to point to who perhaps had a greater influence on the finishes for the art on this one, I think even probably Mike Kaluta would point this out, because I think I even had a little bit of an interaction with him on social media sometime back where he expressed, not bemusement, but, you know, he sort of pointed out, like, Russ Heath really carried this comic in his visual direction. Don't get me wrong, you can see a lot of Michael Kaluta in this, not least of which in the magnificent cover, which is largely untouched Michael Kaluta art. But the interiors, definitely the finishes, were done by Russ Heath, and they really are finishes. Like, they are kind of his line art. If you've seen Russ Heath's work, he was a magnificently talented artist. This really does look like that. Russ Heath did I think he did some Rocketeer stuff, just like Mike Kaluta did. It's funny, Michael Kaluta did the opposite thing on The Rocketeer, where Kaluta he didn't want to do finishes, and so he did a bunch of breakdowns. Dave Stevens, the magnificent artist on The Rocketeer, toward the end of his career, he really became disenchanted with finishing his line art. Like, he just hated the drudgery of doing all the details and the cross-hatching and, you know, finishing, making sure all of that perspective is right. And perspective's always a pain. I say this as an artist myself. I of course, have my own graphic novel called The Ghost of the Badlands that was published late last year and has been a great success beyond my wildest imaginings. Go check that out on Amazon if you get a chance. It's very inspired by The Shadow, by the way. But I can understand that, but it's funny. I find the opposite to be true. I hate doing breakdowns, and I love finishing art. I feel that I'm wired the exact opposite way. But apparently Dave Stevens was totally the opposite. It's funny, there's a great anecdote. I was just reading the Rocketeer collection the other day, and Mike Kaluta had a fantastic anecdote in that where he was like, you know, he told me that finishing the art and working out all that perspective and doing all those layouts for backgrounds, I think it was cityscapes specifically, which Kaluta's so great at, he said it was driving him completely insane. And despite my loudest protests, I could not persuade him that it did the exact same thing to me. Which is a great quote from Michael Kaluta. I'd love to interview him sometime on this show, because Kaluta is a titanic figure in modern Shadow, certainly in the comic format. He, of course, worked on some stuff over at Dark Horse. We've already reviewed the 1970s DC comic series that he really cut his teeth on and really sort of established the iconography of his version of the Shadow. And it is alive and well here and feels a little bit more polished. I have heard differing reports from Michael Kaluta and people around him that have said, you know, he was not so satisfied with how the artwork turned out here, because it was, and I can understand this to a degree, it was a little bit stiff the way that Russ Heath kind of finished his characters. I could get that, because Kaluta's line work is definitely defined by its flowing nature. Sometimes it sort of breaks anatomy perspective a little bit for the sake of gesture, for the sake of pose and a sense of motion, as all great comic artists do. Will Eisner was famous for doing this. A lot of great, Bernie Wrightson and so on and so forth. Russ Heath is much more photorealistic in his approach. He's almost got a woodcut kind of a look to what he does. And there is a stiffness to woodcuts. If you look at Albrecht Dürer or, you know, somebody like that, those classic woodcut, there is a stiffness to that approach. And so Russ Heath, a very polished and clean line, a beautiful look to everything he does. But I have to say, if it between Dave Stevens and Mike Kaluta, he definitely looks more like Dave Stevens, where everything looks very finished, very polished, maybe a little bit stiff in places, maybe a little bit over-referenced in places. But I wouldn't have it any other way. If I were given my druthers, I like the Russ Heath finishes. He does a great job inking this, and if you want to throw flowers at anyone's feet, I would throw them at Russ Heath's a little bit. He does a great job here. Right from the get-go, the summary on the jacket, and keep in mind, I do not have the Dynamite edition of this. I have the original 1987 printing of this from Epic Comics, which I greatly prefer to Dynamite's reprint, by the way. The Dynamite reprint, they darkened the colors a little bit. They kind of messed with them. They look a little bit muddy. And their reprint just wasn't as good, whereas the colors here are just, man, I don't know what they used to color here. It kind of looks like markers a little bit. Maybe markers or pastels or something, possibly watercolors. But anyways, there's a dust jacket on this version of the graphic novel. I don't know if it's the same on the Dynamite version, but it says, who knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men? Times Square, Easter Sunday, April 1941. Amid the bustle of the holiday crowd, a young woman runs for her life. It is a race that will lead from the heart of Manhattan, pulsing with vibrant life, through Hell's Kitchen to Lisbon. Final destination, Berlin, Nazi stronghold and center of dark intrigue. As hot gunfire bursts from an alley behind a burly queue, a cab screeches toward a date with death. Auto chases, motorcycle escapes, and a fantastic battle between a U-boat and an autogyro over Coney Island. Heroes and villains dance like puppets on invisible strings, never knowing for certain if they be players or pawns. Behind the action looms the spectral figure of the Shadow, master of men. What webs and toils unfurl from these mysterious gloved hands? What lives hang balanced between the cold, hollow laughter and the blazing 45s? Who is safe? Who is doomed? Only the Shadow knows. This feels like something of a reintroduction to the character, and some people have speculated. I've watched some pretty bad YouTube reviews of this from people who frankly shouldn't have even bothered. But, you know, some of them are like, well, I imagine they were reintroducing this character to the public because no one knew who he was. And it's like, you guys realize, like, the Shadow Blood and Judgment came out like 1 year before this. It was a good selling comic, right? We've talked about it before this, and it's a very, very good comic by Howard Chaykin. And that was what reintroduced the Shadow, if anything. This probably more so. The reason why this has such a long summary page is because it is unlike a lot of Shadow stories, like the Shadow in his classic mode did fight Nazis. He probably fought communists a lot more in the 30s. But in the 40s, he certainly got into some spycraft and fighting Nazis. He fought Japan a lot, I remember. And then in the 1950s, he became a little bit of a Cold War spy. But one thing that never really happened is they rarely, outside of some really bad modern comic adaptations like that Green Lantern, Green Hornet that I reviewed a while back and was not a big fan of, they very rarely put him in a very specific time and very specific place during a very specific historical event and then pitted him against prominent historical figures. That is not a thing. That is kind of a cheesy modern fiction approach to handling a character like this, a period character. And this comic right here is one of the very few examples of this being done with the Shadow and not sucking. Probably along with the Shadow Strikes. This is one of the only examples. When Dynamite tried to do this in their ongoing series, it was just terrible. I mean, it was insufferable to read because it was like, it felt too much like the writer was champing at the bit to tell historical fiction rather than tell a Shadow story. The Shadow always somehow winds up taking a back seat in stories like that, and you feel like he's almost along for the ride. You're basically just dropping, he often reverts into a 1940s Punisher mode, and that's never a great place for the Shadow because he's not the Punisher. He's basically a spy master in an ongoing, never-ending war on crime. He is an admiral, a general in this war on crime. Nothing establishes this quite like the opening page. I like this opening page. It gives you kind of a dramatis personae, which is, again, I think is intended to introduce us to his agents, who are going to be utilized more extensively than they had to this point, or frankly would be for some time after, with the exception of the Shadow Strikes, which I think was inspired by this graphic novel, by the way. We'll talk about that more in a moment. But I do have to read the opening here at the top of the very first page, this sort of insert. April of 1941, the clouds of war have covered the European continent. Poland, Belgium, Norway, France, and Czechoslovakia lie crushed. Greece and Yugoslavia are fighting for their lives, with the United States remaining neutral and the non-aggression pact with Russia protecting their backs. Interesting they don't describe that as an alliance, but maybe a little political bias on Denny O'Neil's part. Nazi Germany turns its vast war machine toward the proud and defiant, though nearly defenseless, island of Great Britain. There's a spelling error here, by the way, on Great Britain that I've never caught before. But locked in the heart of that terrible engine of dominance and destruction lies the seed of its own doom. Could fate but grasp that seed, plan to nurture it to full crimson bloom, the horror that is Nazi Germany might well be choked in its own blood. And here you have a list of the Shadow's agents. We start light here. We introduce the alter ego of Lamont Cranston. We introduce Margot Lane, because she's just sort of road at this point. Harry Vincent. We introduce Shrevey. And we have Burbank. And these are all the versions of the characters that were in the DC Comics run that was written by Denny O'Neil and illustrated by Mike Kaluta. So in a lot of ways, this is kind of a reunion comic. We don't introduce some of the other guys. We have an opportunity to introduce, like, say, Miles Crofton, who's the Shadow's autogyro pilot. We don't do that. You have at least one opportunity to introduce Hawkeye or Cliff Marsland when they go to sort of a seedy underworld area. We don't do that either. Instead, we keep it nice and small, which for this page length is probably good. I think this graphic novel's like maybe around 70 pages. It's not a long one. This is an 80s graphic novel. This is not a big, thick one. More a bande dessinée kind of a length, the length that a European comic would be today. We open up in the 1941 Times Square, which is just absolutely beautiful. I have to believe this wound up being an inspiration for the 1994 film, deciding to so heavily feature the 1940s or the 1930s version of Times Square. It was featured very, very prominently in the advertising material for the 1994 film, and I have to believe they probably consulted this. speaking of which, in terms of the historicity of when this came out and the environment around it, as I said, this comes on the heels of the Shadow, Blood, and Judgment from DC. It comes on the heels of Walter Gibson's death just 2 years prior. It comes on the heels of the DC ongoing series that started out somewhat strong, then flopped horribly. And then out of nowhere, Marvel Comics, who I do not believe had ever published a Shadow comic and have not published a Shadow comic book since, came out of nowhere and said, okay, well, the Shadow graphic novel, we'll put that in the ongoing epic graphic novel series, just out of nowhere. And it was very well reviewed. It was very well received. I don't know how well it sold. Who knows? It's an older character at this point, and they were putting him back in his original time period. So who knows how well it actually did. We don't have sales figures going back that far. And honestly, comic book sales figures today, they actively conceal from us because the industry is doing so poorly. So who knows? Who honestly knows? What we do know is this was so successful that DC, when they got the rights to the character back 1 year later, or about a year and a half later, instead of continuing the DC series that followed on from Blood and Judgment, the sort of modernized 80s version of the character, they put the character back. I mean, it's almost the Shadow Strikes ongoing comic book series is essentially a sequel to this graphic novel, which is funny because this graphic novel was published at the rival company. So whatever else you want to say about the Shadow 1941, I am firmly convinced, and many other Shadow fans are, that it was this graphic novel right here and the success of it, certainly the creative success of it, that persuaded DC, okay, if we're going to publish comics of this character, they have to be set in the 30s and 40s. We have to put him in his proper time period. And indeed, if you look at what DC Comics did with the Shadow Strikes, it's got the same basic agents. It even kind of deepens their characterization. They wind up introducing a romance subplot between Harry Vincent and Margot Lane, and you have an entire, I think there was a 2-issue one-off just around Shrevey trying to break up this corrupt union, I think is what happened. So it was all the same basic agents. I mean, it follows the pattern the Shadow Strikes does. It follows the pattern of this graphic novel and is very similar in terms of style, just not so much artistically. This graphic novel, obviously being a graphic novel, they can take extra time, and this thing wound up being a real jaw-dropper. We open up in Times Square, though, as I said, with Harry Vincent seemingly nonchalantly bumping into a random German woman who is kind of in a damsel in distress mode. She's being pursued. She doesn't know. Someone's pursuing her to deport her. She thinks it's just immigration people or maybe thugs or something. And she jumps into a local kind of showgirls place, and one of the bouncers decides to kind of defend her. That doesn't really work out. She sort of tries to duck in there, and then Harry Vincent intervenes on her behalf and sort of rescues her. They secret her away into a nearby touring car, and that is when the Shadow intervenes to stop the, whatever they are, gangsters, G-men, whatever, were introduced immediately. They don't take too long, 3-4 pages before we see our first shot of the Shadow, and how gorgeous are the renderings of the Shadow. I'm if any of you have seen my artwork in Ghost of the Badlands or any of the other stuff that I've done, the pulp illustrations in my Night Vale series, I am a cross-hatching fool. I love cross-hatched art and that kind of woodcut look, and this is just absolute eye candy for me. This is some of the nicest sort of classically rendered pre-Raphaelite looking comic book art you're ever likely to see. It's one of the prettiest Shadow graphic novels, maybe the prettiest, pound for pound. But the way they handle these characters with such a delicate touch, the Shadow's voice is bang on. He's not overly engaged with his agents. He is kept completely mysterious. Even when we finally introduce Lamont Cranston a little bit later, when he sort of helps us deepen the mystery of what's going on, and he sort of elucidates why exactly this woman, whose name is Bauer, by the way, why she's being pursued and why they want to take her back to Germany. It turns out she's a Nazi, by the way. And there's an organization that keeps track of German nationals abroad. They want to bring her back. They're not sure. The guy in charge of this organization is Friedrich Wolf, who's like the most cliche-looking German Nazi comic book character ever, which winds up being a brilliant design choice. Because, of course, we learn that there's a little bit of a conspiracy to try and stop and or encourage Adolf Hitler, as has been a rumor for many a year. Even today, they still make documentaries about this, that Adolf Hitler, as we know, was heavily into the occult. And so he was literally at a certain point allowing his opinion of military strategy and public policy to be in some way guided. We don't know to what degree, but in some degree guided by horoscopes and numerology and different things, but especially horoscopes. Rudolf Hess was even more heavily involved in this, and he figures very prominently in the story. And so the idea is that this guy wants to prevent Hitler from attacking the Soviet Union. It's interesting because that positions him as the guy who's going to save Nazi Germany. That's how we set this up to begin with, and we use a lot of historical figures here to do this. But of course, what we learn a little bit later, and this is the real twist, is on the face of it, we love the Shadow fighting Nazis. It's always a blast. It's just like the Shadow wasting Soviets and commies. It's always fun, right? Never not a good time when you can see that. You see a lot less of him fighting commies these days, and we can only speculate as to why if we look at Marvel artist and writer Twitter accounts. But it is a blast when you get this stuff. But this is an interesting twist in that you think that this guy is out to save Germany, because conventional wisdom among historians for years has been, gosh, if Hitler hadn't attacked the Soviet Union when he did, the Axis could have won World War II. But it turns out that what this guy really wants to do, this Friedrich Wolf, is save the Soviet Union. That's really what he wants to prevent Hitler from attacking the Soviets, because he wants to weaken them. And he wants the Soviets to be even stronger, is what he wants, because it turns out that this particular Colonel Wolf, is, in fact, a Soviet who defected over to the Nazis, took an entirely assumed identity, and as we learn in this climactic sequence, it might sound like I'm just blazing through this plot, but it is actually a very simple plot. It's very trim, it's very fast-paced, and I'm really not skipping over much here. It turns out that Colonel Wolf was in fact Volkov or something like that, Volov, or they only say his name once or twice, but he is a Russian, and he was a former Russian Bolshevik, and that he was actually in attendance when Tsar Nicholas and his family were brutally assassinated by the communists. Which, of course, has been a controversial event all throughout history because of the association with Anastasia. Did Anastasia manage to survive? And she's referenced here. This particular graphic novel takes the position that the child did not survive, and that it was Colonel Wolf, the real Colonel Wolf, who used his bayonet to skewer the child. This is a brilliant one. It's funny, it kind of dovetails into an episode of Babylon 5 I watched. It dovetails into an episode of Deep Space Nine that I watched, Duet. It dovetails, too, into the inspiration for both of those stories, which is a story called The Man in the Glass Booth. It was written by Robert Shaw, the actor. And fantastic novel. They made a beautiful film version with Maximilian Schell years ago. And the idea is this guy's pretending to be a Nazi, and the Israelis find out that he survived World War II. He's a war criminal. They actually abduct him over the U.S.'s protests. Semi-historical. That has happened throughout history. And they put him on trial in Israel for his war crimes. And as they are questioning him on the witness stand, it becomes clear he is not a Nazi war criminal. And then it becomes clear he's actually a Jew. And he was in the Holocaust. And he survived the death camps. And he's been impersonating a Nazi because he has a complex, and he's so traumatized by the event, he basically set it up so that it seemed like he was a Nazi so that he could pay for his own weakness and not being able to save his family, and right? Like this kind of mental, and then when confronted with these facts and shown irrefutably who he is and what he has done, he goes completely catatonic and he dies, right? It's an incredible story, one of my favorite stories and movies ever. And this is clearly inspired by that. Very clearly inspired by that, because when the Shadow confronts him with the truth of what he's done as a Bolshevik assassin, the only solution is for him to die at his own hands, or as the Shadow says, skewer yourself, pig. It's incredible. And really, that's a highlight of the comic. One thing that you often don't see in Shadow comics, you see a lot of people just go, oh, it's 40s Punisher, or it's 40s Batman, or it's, right? They want to, I feel like modern writers have to create an analog to the Shadow, where the Shadow is his own creature. The Shadow is a Greek chorus. He is justice, and he is cosmic justice and death meted out by the universe. And like cosmic justice, the Shadow is utterly merciless. He is never wrong. There is nothing that is beyond his brain. There is no mystery that his mind cannot suss out. And he is as terrible as death itself. And so this sequence where the Shadow manages to, well, he had already deduced it a long time ago, so he's really just revealing the fact that he's known all along that Colonel Wolf is in fact a Bolshevik. And as he sort of lays all this out, he lures him sort of hypnotically with Wagner's Götterdämmerung, right? He's playing that over the Victrola. And he's luring him out for a sword fight, which you don't often see from the Shadow. We know that he's an expert fencer, but we know that he's a sword fighter from the pulps. But it's interesting to see that introduced here. You can tell Denny O'Neil had probably been reading a few of the pulps. And as they're fighting him, he's pointing out, this scar on your face. It's not a fencing scar. You're no graduate of Heidelberg. I can tell that from your fencing stance. You know what I mean? Like, he's just taking this man apart. The way he delights in letting him know that you hear this, when you read the pulp stories, you often get this at the end of a story, where the Shadow just layer by layer peels away the deception. One little bit. It is so pulpy. It's one of the few examples of this in comic book form. Denny O'Neil handles this absolutely expertly. But the mercilessness doesn't take full flight until he forces Volko to relive the experience of assassinating the Tsar's family, for which he is actually contrite, right? He actually feels genuine guilt over it. But of course, we establish early on in the comic, and I love this, it's just a little hint. You wouldn't know it if you don't read the pulps. This wouldn't hit you that hard, but it's true, where Lamont Cranston is actually sitting in the touring car, and Lamont Cranston talks of the girasol ring that the Shadow wears on his left hand. And he says he received that from the Tsarist loyalists. He received that in Russia. It's just a little hint. This is personal for the Shadow. We, of course, know, if you read The Red Menace, which I already reviewed here on this channel, that Lamont Cranston in that scene, that famous scene with Prince Zuvor, he takes apart the ring and shows the emblem of the seventh star, the Tsarist loyalists who were anti-Bolsheviks. And it turns out that he was one of the foreigners who was allowed, one of the chosen few who was allowed into the inner circle of the seventh star. This is personal for him. He was a royalist. He was on the side of the Tsar, and he opposed the Bolsheviks. So this is interesting there, and it really brings this into context. This is one of the rare cases where you can almost see something become personal for someone as cold and inscrutable, as calculating as the Shadow. And I love this. This line goes so hard. The Shadow replies, and I quote, "Beg Satan for forgiveness, for you'll not find it this side of hell." I can't. This is too much fun, guys. This is too much fun. Oh, every cool thing about the Shadow is right here in this comic. This is one of my favorites of all time. It might be my absolute favorite of all time. I received this once. I was actually doing missions work or volunteer work at a food bank. And we were, I guess a comic book store had closed down. And so as a part of that, they were cleaning out their excess inventory. And we were, of course, going to be giving these to children, so we couldn't have anything too graphic, too mature, whatever. And so we took a bunch of the more graphic and adult-oriented graphic novels aside put them in a separate pile, and then we were actually allowed by the food bank, if we wanted to, because otherwise they were going to be thrown out, to take them. And so I wound up, my friend and I kind of split them up between ourselves. The guitarist, he was a friend of mine, the pastor's son, and the guitarist in my band, actually. And we were sort of divvying them up and whatever, and I saw The Shadow 1941. And at this point, I don't think I had even seen the movie yet. So I only knew The Shadow from the old advertisements of the movie when that came out, and I was obsessed with it, as I've told you guys, as a little kid, but I never saw it. I had not seen it yet. And so I saw that cover, and I fell in love, and that went in my pile immediately. I was like, oh, that is mine. I'm taking that. You are not taking that. And I walked away with, gosh, a gigantic stack of old Epic graphic novels and DC graphic novels, and some of the greatest stuff, some of my favorite graphic novels of all time wound up in that stack that I just got for free, volunteering at St. Mary's Food Bank here in Phoenix. So you never know where your favorite media is going to find you. And guys, needless to say, from the artwork to the spectacular pulp-inspired scripts, to the historical setting and intrigue, the historical fiction, heavily fictionalized, but really you can tell Denny O'Neil has at least a basic command of the historical facts, and then he sort of fictionalizes in an interesting and captivating way. The soaring oratory of The Shadow, the magnificent chiaroscuro atmosphere evoked by Mike Kaluta, and especially the great Russ Heath. The Shadow 1941, Hitler's Astrologer, is top-flight Shadow comics. It's just superb. If Mike Kaluta is complaining about this art, then respectfully to the legendary Mike Kaluta's wrong. This looks really incredible. He would go on to make some really incredible Shadow comics without Russ Heath, though, throughout the 1990s, and I can't wait to get to some of those in The Coils of Leviathan, Hell's Heatwave, and the movie adaptation, which we already reviewed. But guys, I can't tell you how much I recommend The Shadow 1941. It is in print. You can buy it digitally. You can buy physical copies. They're all over the place, and they don't cost too much. They're like $20 or something on Amazon. It's not too prohibitive. You won't break the bank. But the coloring, everything, at least if you don't buy the Dynamite version, just a stunning book, a stunning achievement, and probably a comic that doesn't get enough credit for the fact that it reoriented The Shadow back into his proper setting, time period, and style. After a number of years experimenting and perhaps, in retrospect, over-experimenting with everything from freezing him and thawing him out in the mid-'80s to do kind of a Dark Knight Returns type storyline and Blood and Judgment, to, of course, the dreaded Shadow RoboCop experience. It was wonderful and comforting, and certainly a welcome change to have the Shadow reoriented into his proper time period. Marvel Comics, folks, they did not make many Shadow comics. In fact, they only made one, but they made it count. This is arguably the best Shadow comic ever published, and for whatever reason, I guess Marvel felt they could never top it, so we'll never touch it again. Way to go, Marvel. Way to go, Denny O'Neil. Way to go, Mike Kaluta. And Godspeed to Russ Heath. Folks, until next time.
The weed of crime bears bitter fruit. Crime does not pay. The Shadow knows.